200 people froze when my father tapped his glass and said, "She's just the housekeeper." He gestured toward me like I was part of the waitstaff, not his daughter. My mother followed with, "Look at your brother. That's success." Ethan smirked and said, "The gala is for family only." A cluster of donors turned to look at me. Then someone whispered, "Wait, she owns 50% of the company." Their expressions shifted fast. Confusion first. Then I panic. Then silence so sharp I could hear the string quartet stop mid-song. I'll never forget the moment the room made space around me, as if I were a problem they didn't know how to categorize. The gala took place at the Mayfield Conservatory in Chicago. Glass ceilings, rented orchids, and people who came only because my parents promised access to capital and influence. It was my father's favorite environment, polished, wealthy, and curated to flatter him. I walked in wearing a simple black dress because the event coordinator insisted on appropriate attire. The coordinator didn't recognize me as family. She placed a staff badge in my hand without hesitation. I asked if there was a mistake. She said my mother had sent the instruction directly. I still wore it. It wasn't worth the argument. My mother approached the donors like she was auditioning for a lifestyle magazine. She wore diamonds that didn't belong to her, borrowed from a jeweler who used the gala for marketing. My father wore the same expression he'd practiced for decades, proud of himself, impatient with everyone else. My brother Ethan arrived late with his wife Claire. They made sure their entrance was noticed. Claire had grown up in a wealthy suburb outside Minneapolis. Her family bought into our family business years ago. She married Ethan because our parents encouraged it. Every choice she made was about status. She barely acknowledged me. Her greeting was a quick glance before turning her focus to the photographers. I stood near the wall holding a tray of champagne flutes. The catering staff had handed it to me when they assumed I worked there. I didn't correct them. It kept me out of the center of the room. It also gave me a clean view of how my family interacted when they believed I had no power. My father began his welcome speech. He thanked donors for supporting the expansion of our family business, Hartwell Manufacturing. The company produced high-grade industrial hardware for hospitals' labs and cleanroom facilities. It wasn't glamorous, but it was profitable. My father kept the narrative simple. He built everything on his own. His son would inherit it, and I was a footnote. When he introduced Ethan, the applause was immediate and loud. People believed Ethan ran the company. They didn't know I held 50% of it. That wasn't an accident. The former majority partner, a quiet man named Charles Brooks, sold me his entire stake 2 years earlier. He'd been pushed out by my father and wanted the company to stay out of my father's full control. He offered it to me privately at a fair price. I used investor returns from a project I'd built myself. I never took a dollar from my parents. I didn't share this information with anyone. I didn't need their approval. During the speech, my mother signaled for the spotlight operator to center the beam on Ethan. The room lit up around him. Then she spotted me in the corner holding the tray. Her expression tightened. She whispered something to my father. He paused, turned toward me, and smiled a rehearsed smile. "Some of you have met our housekeeper," he said. The room quieted fast. Every donor turned. My name sat on the badge, but the title beneath it read, "Housekeeper" in bold. I didn't move. I didn't correct him. I didn't blink. My mother added, "We're grateful she could help tonight. Look at your brother now. That's someone who represents our family well." A few guests laughed. A few looked uncomfortable. Most watched how I reacted. Ethan approached carrying a bourbon he hadn't earned. "The gala is for family only," he said. "You should stand in the back so you don't confuse anyone." Claire didn't hide her smile. She leaned close to a relative, whispering behind her hand, but the intent was clear. They were enjoying the spectacle they had arranged. I didn't respond. I didn't trust myself, too. The humiliation wasn't new. This family treated me as an afterthought for years. They included me only when it made them look generous. They dismissed every accomplishment. They referred to my work as a hobby. They believed I owed them loyalty without receiving any in return. The difference tonight was that the right people were watching. A board member named Susan Drake stepped closer. She'd been a partner of Charles Brooks years ago. She knew more about the company's structure than my parents realized. She glanced at the badge on my dress. Then she leaned toward the guests at her table. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried. She owns 50% of the company. The ripple moved across the floor. People didn't whisper. They exchanged glances. Confusion spread fast. 2 donors looked at the CEO of a partner firm. One investor checked his phone. Someone asked if the comment was a joke. Someone else repeated the number. My father seemed to sense the shift. His expression tightened. He tried to continue his speech, but the room had already moved beyond him. My mother's smile froze. She took a step closer, as if she planned to pull me aside. She didn't get the chance. Someone asked her directly. "Is it true?" Ethan looked at me differently. Not with respect, just calculation. Claire folded her arms and whispered something about legal rights. She wasn't subtle. I remained still. I didn't confirm anything. I didn't deny anything. The music stopped completely when the conductor motioned the quartet to pause. No one wanted background noise. They wanted clarity. My father repeated the line he used whenever someone challenged him. There must be some misunderstanding. The room didn't believe him. Then the event coordinator approached me quietly. She apologized for the badge. She said she had been following instructions emailed by my mother. I told her not to worry. She asked if the rumor was true. I said yes. Her eyes widened. She walked away fast, clearly unsure what she had been part of. The shift in the room grew heavier. People repositioned themselves. Groups formed. Eyes settled on my family and then on me. Information spread through the donor list like electricity. I placed the tray on the nearest table and stood straight. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. "I'm here because I was invited," I said, even if the invitation wasn't meant to be respectful. No one moved. "I'm not the housekeeper," I added, "and my last name is the same as theirs." The silence that followed wasn't dramatic. It was practical. People were reassessing everything they believed about my family, the business, and the succession they'd been told was guaranteed. My brother took one step forward. "Explain yourself." "No," I said. It was the first time I ever said that to him in public. It landed harder than I expected. The room waited for the next move. My father tried to laugh, but the sound didn't match his expression. My mother lifted her chin and prepared another line meant to put me in my place. Before she spoke, I walked toward the exit. I didn't rush. I didn't look back. I didn't owe anyone an explanation. 200 guests watched me leave. They wouldn't understand until much later that the moment I walked out of that room, their version of the Hartwell family ended. And mine began. My parents never tried to hide their preference for my brother. They treated it as a natural fact, like weather or gravity. When I was a child, they said Ethan needed more attention because he would carry the family name. When I turned 10, they said he needed better tutors because he would lead the company someday. When I graduated from high school with honors, they said grades did not matter for girls the same way they mattered for boys. Their explanations changed, but the message stayed the same. My mother rarely missed an opportunity to remind me why Ethan mattered more. She said donors respected men in leadership. She said shareholders wanted strong male succession. She said a daughter created complications. None of these statements were supported by evidence. They were excuses that kept the hierarchy in place. My father enforced it in smaller, quieter ways. He included Ethan in meetings but sent me to prepare refreshments. He took Ethan to conferences but asked me to watch the house. He introduced Ethan to business partners but forgot to mention I existed. He saw Ethan as an extension of himself. He saw me as an obligation he needed to manage. The imbalance became clearer when I entered college. I attended the University of Illinois on a merit scholarship. Ethan attended Northwestern University on my parents' funding. They paid his tuition, his apartment, his car, and even his credit card bills. They did not contribute to mine. They said I should be proud to support myself. I worked in the campus library to cover my expenses. I took extra classes to graduate early. I joined a research program that eventually led to a paid internship. I did everything my parents claimed to admire in other people's children. They did not acknowledge any of it. They talked about Ethan's business electives as if they were accomplishments. After college, I returned home briefly before moving to Chicago for work. During those weeks, I watched Ethan step into the company without resistance. He had no real expertise in operations or finance, but my father gave him a title immediately: Vice President of Corporate Development. It sounded important, but he had no defined responsibilities. My parents treated it as proof that he was ready for leadership. When I said I was preparing to interview at a growing logistics startup, my mother said it was good. I found something practical. She said women needed stable jobs with predictable hours because life was unpredictable. She added that Ethan would handle the demanding work. She meant the important work. The startup became the turning point. They offered me a role in project operations. The job required long hours, fast decisions, and independence. I learned how to evaluate budgets, build teams, negotiate contracts, and track risk. I learned how to manage complicated people and fix complicated problems. I moved up quickly. Within 4 years, I was leading operations for 3 major facilities. My parents never asked about the job. When they did speak to me, they compared my salary to Ethan's. They treated my promotion as luck. They called Ethan's promotion at Hartwell Manufacturing leadership potential. I left the startup after its acquisition by a large holding group. My shares vested. The payout was substantial. It was enough for a down payment on a small property. It was also the foundation that eventually allowed me to buy the stake in Hartwell Manufacturing. That fact becomes important later, but at the time I kept it private. My family never asked about the acquisition. They assumed I had been laid off. During those years, my contact with them decreased. My father sent short messages about holiday schedules. My mother forwarded photos of Ethan and Claire at charity events. They rarely asked how I was doing. When they did, they kept the conversation brief. They said they were proud I was independent. She even managed a thin, practiced smile and said my independence was charming. It was her polite way of saying I was irrelevant to their long-term narrative. The distance became more pronounced when Ethan and Claire married. Their wedding was held at a country club. I was placed at a table with distant relatives who did not know my name. My parents spent the entire evening entertaining donors. When Ethan gave a speech, he thanked my parents, his mentors, and his wife. He did not acknowledge me. Claire later said she assumed I preferred a supportive role. I did not respond. For years, I believed the imbalance was something I had to accept. I convinced myself it was normal. I convinced myself that my work, my income, and my stability were enough. I convinced myself that my family's absence allowed me to build a life on my own terms. I changed my mind the day Charles Brooks contacted me. Charles had been one of the earliest partners at Hartwell Manufacturing. He managed engineering, quality, and production, while my father handled sales and investor relations. They built the company together. When Charles stepped away, he expected a fair exit. Instead, my father pressured him into agreeing to less. My father had more influence on the board, and Charles lacked the resources to fight him. Years later, Charles reached out after learning I worked in operations and had built a reputation for fixing failing systems. He did not comment on my family. He did not compare me to Ethan. He simply asked if I wanted to understand the company's internal structure. He sent documents. He answered questions. He explained patterns my father never intended me to see. 3 months after our first meeting, he told me he was ready to sell his remaining stake. He said the company needed a future that did not rely on favoritism. He said he had watched my parents dismiss everything I achieved. He said Ethan lacked the discipline to lead a company with long-term stability. He asked if I wanted to buy his shares before he went to the open market. I took 2 weeks to review the numbers. The valuation was reasonable. I had enough liquid capital from the acquisition to cover most of the purchase. I financed the rest through a conservative loan backed by my investment account. I completed the transaction quietly. I did not share the information with my family. I wanted time to understand the structure without interference. Owning 50% did not give me management authority. It gave me information. It allowed me to request reports, review bylaws, and access board minutes. That access showed me what people inside the company already knew: Ethan was not running anything. He had a title, but not responsibility. The company's stability depended on middle managers who rarely got credit. My parents continued to present Ethan as the future of the company. The documents told a different story. I spent the next year watching from a distance. I kept my ownership silent because I wanted accurate information. People behaved honestly when they thought no one important was watching. By the time Ethan announced he would host the Gala to celebrate the expansion of Hartwell, I already understood the company's weaknesses better than he did. I was not planning to reveal anything that night. I expected to stay unnoticed, observe board members, and leave quietly. The humiliation at the gala changed that plan. I did not walk out because of embarrassment. I walked out because it confirmed something I already suspected. My parents did not see me. My brother did not see me. They would never see me. They were comfortable with a story in which I served the family but never shaped it. The moment the donors reacted to the truth, I understood something they did not. The balance of power had already shifted. They just had not recognized it yet. The gala ended their version of the story. What happened afterward would become mine. I returned to the conservatory through the service hallway because my coat was still inside. I did not plan to re-enter the gala. I needed the coat and a moment without an audience. The noise from the ballroom carried through the walls conversation music and the same type of social performance my family valued more than honesty. Two of my mother's cousins stepped out from the main room before I reached the coat counter. They stopped walking when they saw me. Neither looked angry. They looked cautious. Linda asked whether the ownership rumor was accurate. I confirmed it. Marianne asked how long I had held the shares. I answered directly. They exchanged looks, whispered to each other, and left without offering anything beyond curiosity. Their reaction matched how they had always treated me, only engaged when something benefited them. At the counter, the coat attendant apologized for handing me the staff badge earlier. She said she had followed instructions sent from my mother's email. She looked uneasy, as if she expected me to blame her for the entire situation. I explained the badge was not her responsibility. She thanked me and avoided further conversation. Before I reached the exit, Claire approached from the opposite direction. Her makeup was uneven from crying. She kept several feet between us and asked if the rumor was real. I confirmed it. She wanted to know why the family had never been told. I explained that nobody in the family had ever asked about my work or my assets. She asked what the board would do next. I did not answer because I had no intention of discussing internal issues with her. She shifted to a different concern. She said donors were losing confidence. She looked more worried about public perception than family issues. When she asked whether I would protect the family name, I said I would focus on people who had earned my consideration. That ended the exchange. The parking structure was less crowded than before. Ethan waited beside my car. His posture showed agitation, but not fear. He wanted control, not reconciliation. He asked what I planned to do now that the rumor had spread. I told him the only plan I had at the moment was to go home. He pushed for specifics. He mentioned the investors who had approached him with questions. He added that my silence made him look uninformed. His tone suggested that the inconvenience mattered more to him than the truth. He claimed the ownership revelation disrupted the succession plan. He listed several concerns: donor confusion, investor distrust, and potential board scrutiny. He acted as though I had created a crisis by existing. I reminded him that ownership filings were public and anyone could have seen them at any time. He paused long enough to realize the information had always been accessible. He simply never checked. Ethan asked why I had bought the shares. I gave a factual answer. It was a sound investment based on the company's long-term performance. He asked if I intended to challenge him. I reminded him that leadership required competence, not entitlement. He pressed again. I repeated that I had not made any decisions about leadership positions. He continued asking variations of the same question until it became clear that he was not seeking information. He wanted reassurance I would not disrupt his role. I did not offer that reassurance. He suggested I deny the rumor. I asked why. He claimed a denial would protect the family's image. I declined. He warned that the board would demand answers. I explained that I would respond to the board directly, not through him. He looked unsettled by that statement. When I moved toward my car door, he shifted as if he intended to block me again. I made it clear that the conversation was finished. He stepped back. He asked one final question: whether I planned to attend the next board meeting. I said yes. That was a factual answer and did not require explanation. The drive home was quiet. I kept the radio off. I replayed the sequence of events from the moment the whispers spread across the ballroom. The reaction from the crowd revealed more about my family than anything they had ever said to me. They cared about control and image. They did not care about accuracy or fairness. I reviewed the evening step by step when I reached my apartment. My mother's cousins showed immediate interest only because they wanted information to share. Claire focused on reputational risk. Ethan focused on the succession plan. None of them asked how I felt or whether I needed support. They wanted solutions for a problem they had created. I opened my laptop and reviewed the bylaws of Hartwell Manufacturing. The rights attached to 50% ownership were straightforward. I had the ability to call a special meeting, request audits, and initiate reviews. These options had been available for 2 years. I had not used any of them because there had been no reason. After the gala, the situation changed. My family had publicly diminished me for years and continued to do so while relying on a narrative that no longer aligned with reality. I reviewed the shareholder list again. Several minor shareholders had strong operational backgrounds. Several board members had expressed concerns about internal management during previous filings. None of this information had been confidential. My family simply assumed I would never involve myself. The laptop screen remained open as I considered the next steps. The decision did not come from anger, it came from practicality. If my family presented a false image of leadership at public events, it jeopardized the company's credibility. If donors realized the family narrative was inaccurate, it could influence future contracts. If investors questioned internal transparency, they could call for independent oversight. These were measurable risks. Ownership came with responsibility. Ignoring these risks would be negligent. I drafted 3 short emails. The first went to the company's legal counsel requesting updated documentation on the next board meeting. The second went to the administrative office requesting the current reporting structure for all executive positions. The third went to the board secretary requesting confirmation of my verified voting status for the coming quarter. None of the emails mentioned the gala. None mentioned my family. They addressed only operational needs. I sat in silence for several minutes after sending them. The decision I made earlier in the night settled into something clearer. I would no longer agree to the terms my family imposed. Their comfort did not outweigh accuracy. Their preference for hierarchy did not outweigh responsibility. Their treatment of me did not outweigh the company's needs. The gala revealed a simple fact: people reacted to the truth faster than my family expected. They responded based on verifiable information, not assumptions. They recognized a discrepancy between the image my family promoted and the structure documented in public records. That discrepancy had consequences. I closed the laptop and turned off the lights. There was no drama at the moment. The next steps were administrative, not emotional. There would be conversations, filings, and meetings. None of these tasks required hostility. They required consistency. The gala ended a long period of silence on my part. The next phase would be direct, documented, and aligned with the authority I already held. I entered Hartwell Manufacturing the next morning using my shareholder access badge. Security verified it automatically. The front desk attendant greeted me and asked if I required anything. I requested a copy of the visitor registry for the week and the latest organizational chart. She printed both documents without comment. Employees in the lobby watched me walk through the security checkpoint. Several recognized my last name, but none approached me. Their reactions suggested they had heard pieces of the gala incident but did not know the full details. Nobody appeared hostile. Most seemed cautious. The elevator brought me to the executive floor. The reception area was quiet. Erin, the executive assistant, stood from her desk and asked whether I needed a meeting with anyone. I asked for access to conference room 2. She retrieved the keys and handed them to me. She only mentioned that the room would be used later in the morning. Conference room 2 overlooked the river and was normally reserved for board business. I spread out the documents I brought: shareholder rights audit request templates and departmental structure reports. My goal was simple. I wanted to organize the information before the next board meeting. Ethan entered without knocking. He closed the door and asked why I was in the building. I stated that shareholders had unrestricted access to executive-level spaces. He claimed my visit created confusion among employees. I requested clarification. He said several staff members asked whether the ownership rumor was accurate. I confirmed that it was public information. He shifted to the succession plan. He said donors expected him to lead the company. He said any change would disrupt their confidence. I asked whether the board had approved him as successor. He admitted it had not. He insisted approval was implied because of past conversations. I asked whether the implied approval existed in writing. It did not. He then asked whether I intended to pursue a leadership role. I repeated that the decision was not formed. He asked again, rewording the question, his hand tapping furiously on the conference table. "You need to be direct." I simply repeated that the decision was not formed. I watched the muscle tick in his jaw. The silence was louder than anything he had said. He left the room without further discussion. 10 minutes later, my father entered. He did not appear angry. He appeared prepared. He sat across from me and asked why I came in unannounced. I stated that shareholders were not required to schedule their visits. He said family courtesy was expected. I responded that organizational consistency mattered more than courtesy. He asked whether I planned to challenge the current leadership model. I said I needed accurate data before determining any action. He asked if I intended to raise concerns at the next board meeting. I said concerns depended on the findings. He pressed for a direct answer. I did not provide one. He attempted to reframe the Gala incident as a misunderstanding. He said the staff badge assignment was accidental. He said he did not intend to call me the housekeeper. I corrected the statement by describing the events exactly as they occurred. He did not dispute the accuracy. He then referenced the family reputation. He claimed donors expected a unified narrative. He expressed concern about the company's public image. I asked whether the company's documents matched that narrative. He did not answer immediately. When he did answer, he acknowledged inconsistencies. He asked how I acquired the 50% stake. I explained the financing structure, vested shares from my previous employer, a cash position from the acquisition, and a conservative loan using my investment account as collateral. He said he had assumed my payout had been minimal. I responded that he never inquired about it. He sat quietly for several moments before changing the topic. He advised me to avoid actions that could destabilize the family. I stated that I would follow documented procedures. He ended the conversation and left the room. Once alone, I reviewed departmental workflows. The inconsistencies were clear. Several approvals were conducted verbally instead of in writing. Budget reports lacked supporting documents. Operational reviews had not been updated in 2 years. Leadership responsibilities were unclear for several executive roles. These issues were measurable and documented. I drafted the initial audit request. It covered internal controls, budget procedures, staffing structures, and reporting chains. Nothing in the request referenced the Gala or my family. The document focused solely on organizational accuracy. Employees walked past the conference room periodically. Some looked inside. None entered. Their expressions indicated uncertainty about how to interact with me. They had never seen me in a working capacity inside the building. Most of them had only heard that I rarely attended family events. Before noon, I left the room and returned the keys to Erin. She thanked me without asking any questions. I walked to a coffee shop across the street and reviewed the materials again. I compared the audit request to the shareholder bylaws. Every step was permitted. There were no compliance issues. While reviewing the company's public filings, I identified additional areas where documentation did not match the narrative my family shared at events. The differences were not dramatic. They were structural. They included outdated succession reports, incomplete departmental records, and financial statements lacking internal annotations. Each issue was solvable, but none aligned with the image presented at the Gala. The more I reviewed, the more one conclusion became unavoidable. The company's internal structure had drifted away from its public narrative. My family relied on the public narrative. Investors relied on the internal structure. When these two areas diverge, risk increases. By the time I left the coffee shop, I had a concise set of next steps. 1. Finalize the audit request. 2. Notify the board secretary of my verification status. 3. Compile a list of discrepancies between public communications and internal reporting. 4. Prepare a summary for the next board meeting. These actions required no confrontation. They required accuracy. The authority behind them came from documented ownership, not family approval. I returned home in the late afternoon. The building was quiet. I organized the files on my desk and created a timeline for each procedural step. No part of the process relied on emotion. Every part relied on policy. The gala had created a public disruption. The next phase would proceed through the company's official structure. Everything would move through the board. My family preferred conversations behind closed doors. The company required documented procedures. I followed the system that carried legal weight. The shift started quietly, but it was already underway. I arrived at Hartwell Manufacturing early on Monday. The parking lot was half full, which was normal for that hour. The reception staff looked at me longer than they had the previous week. The rumors about my ownership stake had clearly circulated. Nobody asked questions, and nobody tried to stop me. The elevator opened onto the executive floor. Erin greeted me with a neutral tone and said the board secretary wanted to see me. I followed her to the office at the end of the hallway. The secretary, Alan Grant, stood when I entered and closed the door behind us. He kept the conversation direct. Several board members had requested confirmation about my shareholder position. He needed my verification packet so he could update the internal registry. I handed him the documents without discussion. He reviewed them quickly and confirmed that everything matched the company's requirements. His only comment was that he expected internal disruption once the registry update circulated. The company had not experienced a sudden shift in major ownership in over a decade. Outside his office, department heads had begun gathering for their weekly operations meeting. Most glanced in my direction but returned to their conversations. Their expressions were mixed uncertainty, curiosity, and in a few cases open discomfort. None approached me. I entered conference room 3 and waited for the meeting to begin. The operations meeting normally included production, finance, supply chain, human resources, and legal. I attended because shareholders were permitted to observe any non-confidential internal session. The policy existed in writing, and nobody challenged my presence. The meeting started with quarterly updates. Production reported delays due to equipment issues. Finance noted a variance in projected versus actual expenses. Supply chain mentioned vendor turnover. Human resources reported a rise in employee exit inquiries. Legal reminded everyone that insurance renewals were pending. The discussion revealed disorganization in multiple departments. Several managers lacked clear budgets. Some roles overlapped. Deadlines were inconsistent. The issues were not catastrophic, but they were systemic. Ethan entered halfway through the meeting. He sat directly across from me and interrupted the production report with questions about whether new machinery orders had been submitted. The production manager said the request was waiting for financial approval. The finance manager clarified that she had not received the request at all. Their communication gap was obvious. The room became tense when Ethan began assigning responsibility without acknowledging the missing steps. Several managers looked frustrated. None confronted him. The dynamic showed who had informal influence regardless of the lack of official authority. After the meeting ended, the Human Resources Director caught up with me in the hallway. She asked if she should prepare documents for the upcoming board session. I asked her to send a summary of staffing gaps, turnover causes, and any unresolved policy concerns. She agreed and sent the files before lunch. The information confirmed deeper organizational problems, unfilled supervisory roles, inconsistent pay scales, and outdated training procedures. I returned to conference room 2 with the reports and built a preliminary framework for the audit request. Each section included measurable issues, operational delays, missing documentation, overlapping responsibilities, and inconsistent reporting chains. The request focused only on structure and compliance. There was no mention of family matters. An email from Erin appeared on my screen. She asked me to stop by my father's office. The message was brief. I walked down the hall and knocked once before entering. My father was standing behind his desk, holding a printed meeting summary. Ethan sat in a chair facing the window. My father asked what I hoped to achieve with the audit. I said the review would provide clarity for the board. He said the company already had a consistent structure. I pointed out that the operations meeting showed the opposite. He dismissed the meeting as exaggerated. Ethan added that employees often overstated issues. I asked whether the problem should be documented. Neither responded directly. My father shifted to the gala again. He claimed the attention from the incident created instability. He said the best option was for me to take a passive shareholder role. I asked whether passive status was required by policy. He admitted it was not. Ethan said my involvement made employees nervous. He said leadership needed to maintain order. I asked whether transparency qualified as disorder. He did not answer. My father then asked whether I intended to push for leadership changes. I restated that my actions were procedural. The conversation stalled when I asked whether the leadership structure had been reviewed in the past 5 years. The meeting ended shortly after, and I left the office. On my way back to the conference room, 2 employees approached me. They introduced themselves as mid-level managers and asked whether the audit would affect their teams. I explained that the audit would examine organization-wide structures, not individual employees. They seemed relieved and thanked me for the clarification. Their reaction showed that communication gaps existed outside the executive floor as well. Later that afternoon, I received an email from Alan, the board secretary. He had completed the registry update and notified the board of my verified 50% stake. He expected several board members to request individual meetings. He asked whether I wanted those scheduled. I asked him to send me the requests in writing before scheduling anything. Within an hour, 3 board members emailed me directly. Their messages were professional and concise. They asked for clarification on my intentions regarding leadership succession and operations. I responded with equal clarity. All plans would follow formal procedure. Nothing would happen outside the boardroom. The internal reaction intensified by late afternoon. Several senior managers began sending me information, claiming they wanted the board to understand the company's challenges. The volume of unsolicited material increased quickly. Some reports were detailed, others were incomplete. The pattern showed that employees had been waiting for a channel to communicate concerns. I organized the documents and sorted them into categories: structural gaps, compliance issues, financial inconsistencies, and communications failures. The list grew longer than expected. The problems were organizational, not individual. Before leaving the building, I passed the hallway outside the executive offices. Ethan was speaking with 2 department heads. Their conversation stopped when they noticed me. No one acknowledged me. Their expressions were rigid. The atmosphere suggested the internal divide was widening. I left the building without addressing them. The situation did not require conflict. The structure already provided the necessary steps. At home, I reviewed everything gathered so far. The information revealed a company running on outdated habits and informal decisions. My family preferred familiarity over documentation, which had allowed problems to accumulate. The audit would expose the gaps clearly. Nothing in the process was dramatic. Each step followed policy. The resistance from my family increased, but it did not alter the requirements. The company needed a documented review, and I had the authority to request it. The internal resistance became more visible that day, but it did not change the direction of the process. Everything moved forward, one document at a time. The security office contacted me early the next morning. The head of security, Michael Ross, said someone had accessed restricted storage overnight. He asked me to review the footage because the system flagged irregular movements in Archive Room B. My first thought wasn't anger, but a cold sense of confirmation. I told him I would come in immediately. Michael met me at the security desk and replayed the footage. The video showed Ethan entering the archive at 12:43 in the morning. He stayed for about 20 minutes and left with a stack of folders. He returned 40 minutes later and put most of them back. Several files were missing. Michael confirmed that the archive logs did not show any authorization for late-night access. Watching him move, calculating, and quick solidified everything I had suspected. This wasn't negligence. It was an attempt to cover tracks. I asked Michael to list the missing files. He compiled a document and sent it to me within the hour. The missing items included quarterly expense reports, vendor contracts, and internal audit drafts from 2 years earlier. The content aligned exactly with the areas most exposed by the upcoming audit. I forwarded the list to my attorney, Laura Kim, and summarized the footage. She told me to preserve the files under a litigation hold. She also said the board needed to be notified because unauthorized removal of documents could be considered obstruction. Her response was direct and procedural. Before sending anything to the board, I asked Michael to secure all archive access and issue temporary badges only with written approval. I didn't need to explain my reasons. The footage spoke for itself. He executed the request without hesitation and assigned a second guard to monitor the area. No further irregular activity occurred that morning. I then met with Laura at her office. She reviewed the footage frame by frame and said the pattern looked deliberate. Ethan had targeted specific cabinets rather than browsing. She drafted a notice to the board indicating that critical documents were missing and that archive access required immediate control. The message contained no commentary, only verifiable facts. After leaving her office, I returned to Hartwell Manufacturing to continue gathering internal reports. Several employees stopped by the conference room throughout the day. I didn't encourage them to talk, but they came anyway. Some brought written documentation of overdue maintenance delayed budgets or gaps in supervisory coverage. Others shared emails showing conflicting directives from the executive team. Their submissions were steady and consistent. It was as if a dam had broken, releasing years of frustration into documented reports. None of them made accusations about individuals. They reported measurable problems. Most left quickly saying they did not want to be involved in anything beyond documentation. At noon, the compliance manager, Rachel Hill, requested a private meeting. She looked tense but focused. She brought a binder containing audit memos issued over the past 4 years. She said some memos had been ignored and others had been sent back for revision without review. Many of the concerns she had raised matched the issues appearing in the new employee reports. One memo described incomplete vendor verification. Another pointed out unapproved expense patterns. A third warned that the company's internal communication chain lacked documentation, which created inconsistent decision-making. Rachel said she could not confirm whether the memos reached the board because she had received no follow-up. When I saw the sheer volume of her ignored warnings, I felt a deep, weary frustration, not just with my father, but with the entire culture of willful blindness he had fostered. I told her to email them to the board secretary so they entered the official record. She sent them before leaving the room. Later in the afternoon, the finance controller, Martin Rhodes, entered with 6 spreadsheets. He said the production department had repeatedly submitted inaccurate inventory counts, which affected budgeting and forecasting. He also said the executive team often approved expenses without documentation. He had records of the approvals and the missing forms. The volume of incoming information increased throughout the day. By early evening, the conference room table was full of reports, memos, charts, and folders. I organized everything into a digital archive. The consistency across departments was the loudest condemnation. Around 6 o'clock in the evening, the board secretary, Allen, stopped by with hard copies of the updated shareholder registry. He confirmed my 50% ownership and my right to request a full internal audit. Allen handed me a sealed envelope from one of the independent board members, Dr. Meredith Caldwell. She requested a meeting to discuss the company's compliance posture. Her note was concise and neutral. Her professional distance was exactly what I needed. While finalizing the summary, an email arrived from my father. He wanted me to stop the audit request. He claimed the company did not need external review. He said the information I had gathered would cause unnecessary disruption. His message was brief but strongly worded. I forwarded the email to Laura without adding comments. She advised responding only through formal board channels and reminded me that shareholder rights could not be overridden by executive preference. I sent the acknowledgement confirming the audit request would proceed according to policy. I saved the security footage in a secure folder and created a second backup. By the end of the night, I had a full picture of the evidence surge. Employees provided structured documentation. Compliance delivered 4 years of memos. Finance added accounting discrepancies. Security confirmed unauthorized archive access. The information was verifiable and consistent across departments. Nothing in the process relied on interpretation. Every document contained dates, signatures, and clear factual content. This was my shield and my weapon in incontrovertible proof. The audit request would proceed with a substantial record. I left the building at 10:15 in the evening. The office was quiet. The documentation already established the next steps. The gala rehearsal took place the next afternoon at the Harborview Cultural Center. The building rented the main ballroom to corporate donors, and my family had secured it months earlier through the company's sponsorship program. When I entered the lobby, several coordinators were arranging seating charts and adjusting lighting positions. None of them looked at me twice. I was dressed in business attire, not evening wear, and carried a folder of audit documents. My mother arrived first with my sister-in-law, Claire. They claimed the front section of the room and spoke with the event planner. My mother noticed me as soon as I walked toward the seating area. She pointed toward a cluster of chairs near the back and said I should stand there to avoid blocking the rehearsal path. Her tone was firm. Claire avoided eye contact and focused on her phone. My father entered a few minutes later. He carried a printed program and discussed the speaker order with one of the coordinators. He glanced at me and nodded without speaking. He showed no sign that we had exchanged emails about the audit request the previous night. The rehearsal began with microphone checks. The coordinator asked all family members to gather near the main stage. When I stepped forward, my brother stepped in front of me. He placed himself between me and the coordinator and said I was not part of the speaker list. The coordinator looked confused but followed his direction. My mother remained silent. I stood off to the side and waited. The coordinator continued with the rehearsal order. My father practiced his introduction for the donors. He spoke about community support, corporate partnerships, and family unity. His statements did not match the turmoil inside the company or the conversations occurring behind closed doors. The coordinator then reviewed seating assignments. My brother and his wife received a front table. My parents received the central table near the stage. Extended relatives filled the next two tables. When my name appeared on the list, it was placed near the staff coordinator's table. The planner read it aloud without hesitation. No one objected. My mother turned her attention to the floral arrangements. I asked the planner whether there was a mistake. She showed me the chart and said the assignment came directly from my father's office. She also said the event required strict adherence to the list because the donors were sensitive to seating hierarchy. I thanked her and stepped aside. During a break, my aunt approached me. She spoke quietly and said the family believed I was creating unnecessary tension by requesting an internal audit. She said the gala was not the place to resolve corporate matters. She asked if I could postpone the request until after the quarter ended. I told her the request would proceed on schedule because the documentation supported it. She did not argue. She returned to her table. My father called for a brief family meeting in a side room. He said the gala needed to run smoothly because donors expected a polished presentation. He said the company could not afford negative attention. He told me to avoid discussing business with anyone at the event. He then leaned closer, his voice low and tight. That audit request, it's creating a distraction. You need to end it. I simply confirmed the board had been notified. He said I was acting without regard for the company's stability. He said the audit would undermine investor confidence. I responded that the documentation showed operational issues requiring independent review. The conversation did not progress. He dismissed the meeting. When we returned to the ballroom, several distant relatives had arrived. They greeted my brother enthusiastically. When they saw me, they asked if I was helping coordinate the event. One of them pointed to the staff coordinator's table and said she thought I was working with the planning team. I corrected her and said I was a shareholder attending as a family. She apologized but looked uncertain. The rehearsal continued. The planning team directed family members through the entrance process. When my turn should have arrived, the coordinator moved on without calling my name. My brother told her I was not part of the formal entrance group. The coordinator nodded and adjusted the list. I stayed near the sidewall until the walkthrough ended. The coordinators thanked everyone and asked that we clear the ballroom so staff could prepare for the next event. As I left, I heard two relatives discussing the company's current performance. They mentioned rumors about operational delays and inconsistent communication at the executive level. They did not know I owned half of the company. They did not know I had requested an internal audit. The next morning, I met with Dr. Caldwell. She reviewed my documentation and asked direct questions. She examined the audit memos, the accounting discrepancies, and the missing files from the archive. She said the evidence met the threshold for a full review. She also requested independent verification. I told her the documentation was stored in 3 secure locations. She asked whether I had notified the full board of the unauthorized archive access. I confirmed that Laura had sent the notice. She asked whether security had restricted access. I confirmed that as well. Dr. Caldwell said she supported the audit and would speak with the audit committee chair. She asked whether I anticipated pushback from my father or brother. I said their responses indicated resistance. She advised documenting all communication. The meeting lasted less than an hour. Her approach was procedural and consistent with her reputation. By afternoon, the final gala preparations were underway. The event planner sent a confirmation email listing the final seating chart. My seat remained at the staff coordinator's table. The company's donors filled the front 3 rows. Prominent business partners occupied the center. Several board members confirmed attendance. Just before the event began, my mother approached me in the hallway. She said many relatives believed I should not enter through the main entrance because it would confuse the guests. She said the staff coordinator's table was appropriate for someone who had caused recent disruption. She referred to the audit request as an unnecessary escalation. She said donors needed stability. My father joined her and said the same. He told me to stay near the back and avoid drawing attention. He said the company needed a united front. He said the audit request risked damaging the company's reputation. He asked me to withdraw the request entirely. I told him the documentation justified the audit and the board had already received notice. He ended the conversation. Minutes later, guests began entering the ballroom. The room filled quickly. The coordinator directed people to their tables. My assigned seat was beside 2 junior staff members assisting with logistics. They greeted me politely, but appeared confused by my placement. My brother approached the table. He said I should not expect anyone to acknowledge me during the event. He said my involvement in company matters was disruptive. He said donors trusted him and my father. He made no effort to hide his irritation. My mother walked past and told me to let your brother lead. She pointed toward him and said he represented the family's success. She said I should focus on staying out of the way. Her tone was unchanged from earlier years. A few minutes later, the first whisper began from one of the junior accountants at a nearby table. She recognized my name on the shareholder registry that had circulated privately among some staff. She asked another accountant whether I was the majority shareholder. The other accountant said she had heard I held half of the company. Their conversation spread rapidly to the next table. One of the donors overheard and asked a coordinator for clarification. The coordinator looked at the program and said she did not know. She directed him to the company's liaison, who confirmed that the registry listed me as owning 50% of company shares. The donor looked surprised and repeated the information to the people at his table. Within minutes, several guests turned toward the back of the ballroom. The whisper moved through the crowd in a steady pattern. Some looked at me directly. Others looked at my brother and my parents. My brother noticed the shift in the room. He saw the expressions changing around him. He followed their line of sight and saw people looking at me. His posture changed. My mother looked around and tried to resume conversation with guests near her table, but the tone had shifted. The recognition did not come through an announcement. It spread through quiet confirmation. The guests realized the person seated near the staff coordinator's table owned half of the company sponsoring the event. The shift was factual, visible, and impossible for my family to control. The gala program began with a short video about the company's community projects. Guests applauded politely, while servers moved through the aisles with trays of water and coffee. When the lights brightened, the coordinator announced my father as the first speaker. He walked to the stage and adjusted the microphone without looking in my direction. He opened his remarks with a summary of the company's growth. He highlighted my brother's leadership and the family's supposed unity. He referred to the evening as a celebration of teamwork. His statements did not match the turmoil inside the company or the conversations occurring behind closed doors. About 10 minutes into his speech, he shifted to acknowledging family members. He listed my mother first, then my brother, then my sister-in-law, Claire. The spotlight moved across the room and found each of them. They stood briefly and waved. When it came to me, he hesitated for a second and said I was assisting with event coordination. He gestured vaguely toward the back where the staff tables were located. Several guests looked confused. The spotlight did not move toward me. My brother grinned as he lifted his glass. Claire whispered something to the relative beside her and laughed. My mother kept her eyes on the stage as if nothing unusual had happened. The reaction around the room changed again. Guests who had already heard about my share ownership knew the introduction was inaccurate. They exchanged brief glances and lowered their voices. A donor sitting 2 tables away asked the person next to her whether my father realized the registry had been circulated. The person shrugged. The coordinator signaled for the servers to begin dinner service. Guests at the front tables received plates first. When the servers reached the back, the lead server stopped beside my table and looked uncertain. She checked her list and said my row was scheduled to receive food after the rest of the room. She apologized and said the instruction came directly from the event planner. She offered water and stepped away. My brother noticed the delay and walked toward me. He leaned close, his breath smelling faintly of whiskey, and said the event was for family and partners, not for someone who created problems. He waited for me to flinch. I just looked past him, acknowledging the full room. He did not wait for a response. My mother approached next. She said the evening was important for the company's reputation and asked me not to behave in a way that would confuse donors. She gestured toward my brother and said he represented the family. She said my presence would be less noticeable if I stayed seated. My father remained on stage while these interactions occurred. He continued praising my brother's management skills and thanked him for carrying the company forward. He said loyalty and tradition define the company's success. He referred to the company as his legacy. He did not mention my shareholder stake. The servers finished distributing the first course. My table was still empty. The two staff assistants seated beside me looked uncomfortable. They offered to bring me something from the kitchen. I declined. The situation was already visible to the guests who had been watching. Near the middle of the meal, a distant relative named Diane approached my mother's table and asked why I had not been served. My mother said the seating chart placed me with support staff, so the service schedule differed. Diane pointed out that I was a family member. My mother said the arrangement was appropriate. Several board members had arrived shortly before dinner. One of them, Karen Burke, recognized me and walked toward my table. She asked whether the seating assignment was intentional. I said the event planner could confirm the placement. Karen reviewed the program briefly and returned to her table without commenting. Her expression suggested she understood the situation clearly. A few minutes later, my father moved on to his closing remarks. He spoke about the company's stability and credited my brother for maintaining strong leadership. He said the company valued clarity and order. He said the evening demonstrated unity. None of these statements aligned with the internal documentation I had gathered or with the ongoing audit preparations. After he finished, the room applauded. The coordinator instructed the next speaker, a community partner, to come forward. During the transition, several donors turned toward my section. They had noticed the inconsistent information. Some whispered to each other about the shareholder registry. Others looked toward my parents with uncertainty. During the program intermission, my aunt approached me again. She looked uneasy. She asked why my father had introduced me as event staff. I told her only my father could answer that. She said the donors were asking questions about company ownership. She said the room was paying attention. My brother returned to my table. He lowered his voice and said the whispers would stop if I left quietly. He claimed the family wanted to avoid embarrassment. He said the company needed a stable public image. His demeanor was more tense than before. I told him the audit request had nothing to do with the gala. I also told him guests were reacting to the information available to them. He insisted the rumor about my ownership stake was misunderstood. I said the information was documented and correct. He walked away without responding. The next speaker finished quickly, and the coordinator announced a short break before dessert. Many guests stood and moved around the room. Several passed my table and slowed enough to observe the seating arrangement. A donor from a regional logistics firm approached me directly and asked whether I was the majority shareholder. I confirmed ownership of 50%. He looked toward the front tables and said he did not understand the seating plan. I told him the planner followed instructions from my father's office. He thanked me and returned to his table. The spread of information accelerated during the break. A board member approached my father near the stage and asked about my absence from the family section. My father brushed it off and said the planning team handled the seating. Several donors overheard his response and exchanged skeptical glances. When dessert service began, servers again passed my table without stopping. The lead server approached apologetically and said she could bring something from the kitchen. I told her she did not need to change the schedule. She hesitated and said she would bring something anyway. My father took the stage again to offer closing remarks before the evening transitioned to the networking portion. He thanked the donors and highlighted my brother's contribution again. At the end of his remarks, he referenced the company's future direction. The comments were vague. He did not acknowledge my role as an owner or the pending audit. When the networking portion started, guests moved around the room freely. Several made an effort to greet my parents. A few approached my brother and asked about expansion plans. The conversations around me, however, focused on the growing discrepancy between the seating arrangements and the shareholder registry. A donor approached my father and said she had heard conflicting information about company ownership. My father attempted to redirect the conversation, but the donor pressed further. She asked why a 50% owner was seated with event staff. My father provided a short explanation about avoiding confusion during the event. The donor did not look convinced. My mother pulled me aside shortly after. She said I should leave before more questions arose. She insisted the evening had already become complicated and that donors were sensitive to internal issues. She said I had created the problem by requesting an audit. She said the family needed control of the narrative. I said the company needed accurate oversight and the board had documentation. I said guests were responding to the facts, not rumors. My mother said facts were not the issue. She said appearances mattered more. As she spoke, another donor approached and asked directly whether I intended to take a leadership role in the company. He had seen the registry and wanted clarity. I answered factually. I held 50% ownership and had not announced any leadership decisions. My mother stepped back without responding. The atmosphere continued shifting. Guests spoke openly about the contrast between the family's public presentation and the emerging information. Several board members watched from their tables. The situation was no longer contained. By the end of the evening, my family had lost control of the narrative. The public introduction, the seating arrangement, the delayed service, and the way they handled questions created a visible pattern. Guests recognized the discrepancy immediately. The humiliation was not mine, it was theirs, and it unfolded in front of 200 witnesses. The morning after the gala, the audit committee held an unscheduled meeting at the Harborview Tower headquarters. The board secretary notified me at 7:30 in the morning that several members requested clarification regarding the shareholder registry and the events at the gala. He also said the committee wanted to review the preliminary evidence I had gathered. I confirmed attendance and asked for a secured room. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the main conference room was prepared. The board members arrived in small groups. Some greeted each other quietly. A few avoided my father and my brother entirely. Dr. Caldwell sat at the head of the table and asked everyone to take their seats. My father entered with my mother and my brother Ethan and Claire. He looked tired, but attempted to appear composed. They chose seats near the center, but several board members did not acknowledge them. Claire arrived last and sat beside my brother without speaking. Dr. Caldwell called the meeting to order. She stated the purpose clearly to review operational concerns, documentation irregularities, and shareholder matters that surfaced within the last 72 hours. She asked if any member objected to discussing the audit request. No one spoke. She then asked me to present the documentation. I placed the encrypted drive on the table and provided printed summaries for each board member. My father objected immediately. He said the meeting was unnecessary and claimed the documentation was exaggerated. He told the board that internal matters should be handled privately. Dr. Caldwell interrupted him and said the audit committee had authority to review all concerns without executive approval. She asked him to wait until the end of the presentation before providing comments. He shifted back in his seat and crossed his arms. I began with the missing archive files. I displayed the footage showing my brother entering the restricted room at 12:43 in the morning and leaving with documents. I showed the badge logs and the list of missing reports. The footage was clear, and the board watched without speaking. My brother leaned back and said the visit was routine. Dr. Caldwell asked him to explain why no authorization existed for after-hours access. He said he did not remember the exact reason. His answer was incomplete. Next, I presented the financial discrepancies identified by the controller, Martin Rhodes. The spreadsheets showed repeated gaps in documentation, inconsistent signatures, and unverified expenses. The board members reviewed the pages carefully. One of them asked Martin whether any corrections had been approved by the executive team. Martin said they often went unanswered. Several members exchanged glances. I moved on to the compliance memos submitted by Rachel Hill. 4 years of audit concerns were displayed in chronological order. The memos documented specific procedural gaps and unresolved issues. The board asked Rachel whether she had received responses. She said she had not. My father said the memos were unnecessary and that the company operated efficiently. His response did not align with the documented concerns. The room became quieter as I continued. I presented statements from employees documenting repeated operational delays and inconsistent directives from leadership. Dr. Caldwell asked whether the employees faced retaliation concerns. I said several expressed caution, but provided factual reports. The committee took notes. When I finished summarizing the operational side, Dr. Caldwell asked about ownership. The board secretary distributed updated shareholder certificates confirming my 50% stake. Several members reviewed the documents again, even though they had seen them before. My father attempted to redirect the conversation. He said ownership did not change the company's leadership structure. He insisted the audit would damage the company's public image. Dr. Caldwell replied that avoiding scrutiny would damage the company more. She reminded him that shareholders had legal rights. The board asked me to explain how I acquired the shares. I gave a factual summary initial capital for my consulting work, followed by structured acquisitions through registered investment entities. The process followed standard disclosure and met all legal requirements. I provided purchase records. My father interrupted again and said I had acted behind the family's back. He accused me of undermining the company. Dr. Caldwell clarified that all purchases were lawful and that shareholders did not require executive permission. The tone in the room shifted. Several members appeared impatient with his interruptions. At this point, one of the board members, Karen Burke, addressed the committee. She said the events at the gala created reputational concerns. She referenced my father's introduction of me as event staff. She said this conflicted with the ownership documentation. She also said donors had approached her with questions about misrepresentation. My father said the introduction was a misunderstanding. Karen said the explanation did not match the seating chart. She said donors noticed inconsistent treatment and requested clarity. My mother said the arrangement was meant to avoid confusion. The board showed no sign of accepting that explanation. Dr. Caldwell asked whether my father understood the potential implications of misrepresenting an equal shareholder at a public event. He did not answer directly. He said he wanted to maintain order. She responded that accurate representation was a fundamental requirement of corporate governance. One board member asked whether the gala treatment was part of a larger pattern within the family business structure. The question made my mother uncomfortable. She looked down at her hands and remained silent. The committee moved on to the audit vote. Dr. Caldwell said the evidence justified a full independent review. She asked whether any board member opposed the motion. My father raised his hand, and my brother followed. No one else joined them. The vote proceeded. 11 members voted for the audit. 2 voted against. The motion passed. My father objected again and said the audit was unnecessary. Dr. Caldwell said the decision was final. After the vote, several board members asked whether I intended to pursue leadership changes. I said my focus was on accurate procedures, not titles. My father said I was attempting to take control. I said the audit was based on documented gaps. He repeated that I was dividing the company. I said the documentation showed internal issues requiring correction. The board members listened without questioning my statements. Then Dr. Caldwell turned to my father. She asked about his plan to address the missing documents and the lack of executive responses to compliance memos. He gave general statements about oversight and teamwork. She said general statements would not satisfy regulatory requirements. A second vote followed regarding temporary modifications to executive authority during the audit. The proposal limited unilateral decision-making until the audit concluded. The vote passed 8-5. My father objected again. He said the board did not understand the operational flow. They did not respond. At the end of the meeting, Dr. Caldwell summarized the decisions. An independent audit was approved. Executive authority was temporarily restricted, and all departments were required to provide full documentation. She also stated that the board would prepare a public statement to ensure transparency. As the meeting adjourned, several members approached me. They asked for additional copies of the summaries. They said clarity was necessary for their roles. They did not approach my father or my brother. My mother left the room without speaking. Claire followed her. My brother walked past me and said I had destroyed the family. He said the board only listened to me because of my ownership stake. I said the board responded to documented facts. He said none of it mattered. He walked away. My father stayed behind and asked for a private conversation. I told him the meeting room needed to be cleared for the committee's next session. He persisted. I said any discussion about the company must go through the board or legal counsel. He said the family deserved consideration. I said the documentation required action. He stopped insisting. The reveal was completed. The board understood the structure. The ownership was confirmed. The audit was approved. The control they assumed they held was gone, and the shift occurred through verifiable facts, not debate. The board released the public statement 2 days after the audit vote. It confirmed the launch of an independent review and directed all departments to cooperate fully. It focused entirely on procedure. My family may have preferred drama, but I was committed to policy. Shortly after the announcement, the audit team led by Scott Neville began work. Employees quickly contacted the team, submitting evidence of expense discrepancies, vendor issues, and long-standing communication problems. The volume of documented issues increased steadily each hour, forcing the audit team to expand their initial scope. My father called an executive meeting the next morning. He attempted to direct staff to ignore the audit's requests, but the legal advisor present quickly shut down the effort. Scott Neville arrived with 3 specialists and demanded full access to systems and contracts. My father attempted to redirect the schedule, but Scott stated the timeline came from the board. My brother objected to the interviews, claiming they were unnecessary. Scott reminded him that participation was not optional, and the auditors proceeded without further delay. I realized then that the auditors were moving with a surgical detachment, something my family could not comprehend. The board scheduled a follow-up meeting that afternoon, reviewing the first set of audit notes. The findings indicated repeated failures in documentation and oversight. The board was concerned by the scale of the issues and mandated a status update every 48 hours. My father and brother left the building shortly after the meeting. My mother called that evening. She said the audit created unnecessary stress and put the family's reputation at risk. She asked if I understood the long-term impact. I said the long-term impact came from the documentation, not the audit. She ended the call quickly. Her focus was always external. She never once asked about the facts the audit uncovered. The next morning, the auditors requested archived executive communication to clarify decision-making timelines. My brother resisted, calling the requests invasive, but the legal advisor confirmed the requests were standard procedure. During the subsequent board meeting, Dr. Caldwell redirected my father from presenting company accomplishments, demanding he address the documentation gaps instead. He claimed he did not recall seeing the compliance memos, which Rachel confirmed she had sent. He attributed the failure to the high volume of emails, but Dr. Caldwell noted the memos contained warnings about significant operational risk. The board questioned my brother about his after-hours archive visit. He offered vague explanations, claiming he removed documents because they were disorganized. The board did not challenge him directly, but their notes increased. I watched him flounder, realizing that his lifetime of entitlement had left him utterly unprepared for simple accountability. Near the end of the meeting, Dr. Caldwell announced that the board would take temporary oversight of certain executive functions until the audit concluded. She stated this was procedural, not disciplinary. My father argued the decision undermined his authority. She said the board's responsibility was to maintain stability for all shareholders. My brother insisted the audit was an attack on the family. Dr. Caldwell responded that it was an examination of the company, not the family, and that the board's duty was to shareholders. My father approached me in the hallway, claiming the audit humiliated him. He said I could have warned him. I said the audit came from documented concerns, not personal intent, and that the issues existed before the request. He walked away. The board approved the audit team's request for expanded access to internal systems and issued a temporary decision restricting executive approval of expenses over $5,000. My father objected. The board overruled him. The shift in power happened gradually. The authority of the executive team decreased with each board vote. The audit team increased its oversight with each document request. Employees cooperated more with the auditors than with the executives. The company's structure adjusted around the facts like a dislocated bone snapping back into place. By the end of the week, operational control rested with the audit committee and the board, not the family. The change occurred through a series of procedural actions. The family lost influence. The company followed a documented process. The audit team returned for the third week of interviews. Their findings were not final, but the patterns were consistent. The gaps in documentation, communication, and financial controls appeared across multiple departments. Each issue traced back to decisions made by my father or my brother. None of it was speculation. Every point had a date, a signature, or an email attached. The board scheduled a full meeting to discuss temporary leadership adjustments until the audit concluded. They invited the executive team, legal counsel, and the audit committee. The room filled quickly. The atmosphere was controlled, not tense. No one raised their voice or moved abruptly. Everyone waited for the agenda to begin. Dr. Caldwell opened the meeting. She summarized the audit team's interim report. She said the findings did not indicate criminal conduct at that stage, but they confirmed chronic administrative failures. She said the failures created measurable risk. She said the board had a responsibility to address those risks immediately. My father attempted to interrupt, but she asked him to wait for the discussion period. He complied. The board introduced a proposal to suspend certain executive privileges. They said decisions requiring high-level approval should be routed through the audit committee. They also said operational oversight would shift to the interim management team until the audit was complete. The proposal did not mention removal. It only addressed procedures. My father objected and said the company had never operated under divided leadership. He said the proposal weakened the company's public image. The board countered by reminding him the audit itself revealed internal instability, not the proposal. Several members asked him to address specific issues found in the interim report. They asked why documentation was missing. They asked why compliance memos received no response. They asked why the executive calendar showed gaps in communication. He gave broad answers. He did not provide dates or details. My brother responded defensively to questions about his archive visit. He said the files were outdated. He said he needed them for a presentation. He said the missing documents were probably misplaced. None of his explanations matched the footage or the badge logs. The board listened without reacting. They recorded every statement. When the discussion ended, the board voted. The proposal passed. My father would retain his title, but lose immediate authority over high-level decisions. My brother's role would be reviewed after the audit report was complete. My mother stared straight ahead. She did not speak. After the vote, the meeting shifted to a procedural review. The audit team outlined the next steps. They requested additional documentation, scheduled department-wide interviews, and established submission deadlines. Their instructions were clear and non-negotiable. As the meeting adjourned, several board members approached me. They thanked me for providing accurate documentation. They said the process would protect the company. They said the audit would establish long-term stability. Their comments were procedural, not emotional. My father waited until the room cleared before walking toward me. He asked for a private conversation. He said the board exaggerated the issues. He said the audit painted him unfairly. He asked whether I intended to replace him. His questions were direct. I told him the findings came from documented evidence, not personal opinions. I said the audit was necessary to correct the company's internal failures. He asked whether I realized the impact on the family's reputation. I said the company's stability came before public perception. He did not respond. My mother called shortly after I left the building. She said the board disrespected my father. She said I caused the situation by bringing the audit forward. She repeated that the family needed unity. I said the company needed accuracy and compliance. She paused for several seconds and ended the call without further comment. Over the next several days, the company adjusted to the new structure. The interim management team issued clear instructions. They removed redundant approval steps, established formal communication channels, and reorganized department workflows. Employees followed the new procedures without resistance. My father and brother remained in their offices, but their influence decreased. Employees routed decisions through the interim team. Vendors contacted the audit department instead of the executive floor. The change was practical and visible. During one of the follow-up board meetings, Dr. Caldwell asked me whether I wanted to take a formal leadership role once the audit concluded. I said I had not made a decision. She said the board needed clarity for future planning. I told her I needed more time. She accepted the answer. Later that afternoon, a group of employees asked to meet with me. They said they appreciated the audit. They said the company finally addressed problems they had reported for years. They did not praise me personally. They stated facts about improved workflow. They said the changes helped them complete their tasks accurately. Their comments were straightforward. 2 days later, my father requested another conversation. This time, he was less confrontational. He said he wanted to understand my intentions. He said he did not want to lose the company. He asked if I planned to remove him. I said the board would decide leadership based on the audit findings. He said he wanted a chance to correct his mistakes. I said the audit would document facts, not assumptions. He did not ask for sympathy. He asked for time. I said the audit schedule was fixed. My brother did not speak to me directly. He avoided meetings where I was present. When he attended, he remained silent unless questioned. The board noticed. The audit team noticed. His position weakened through his own choices, not through confrontation. Near the end of the week, the auditors submitted their second interim summary. It listed process failures, missing documents, inconsistent approval chains, and communication issues. The summary did not assign blame. It only presented evidence. The board reviewed the summary and scheduled another meeting. Before the meeting, Claire approached me in the hallway. She said the family was overwhelmed. She said the pressure was affecting their marriage. She asked if I intended to take everything. I said the audit focused on company structure, not personal consequence. She thanked me for answering and walked away. The board meeting began shortly after. The audit team presented the new summary. The board asked for clarification on several points. They discussed potential restructuring. They said executive oversight needed revision. They said leadership decisions would depend on the final audit report. My father sat quietly. My brother shifted in his chair, but said nothing. At the end of the meeting, Dr. Caldwell addressed the room. She said the company was entering a period of transition. She said the board's priority was stability. She said leadership would be evaluated based on capability, not family relations. She said accurate documentation would determine the path forward. Her statements were direct. They contained no commentary. When the meeting ended, I gathered my documents and prepared to leave. My father approached me again. He said he understood the situation more clearly. He said he realized the company needed procedural oversight. He said he hoped the audit would give him a chance to improve. His tone was different. He did not argue. He did not raise his voice. He acknowledged the process. I told him the audit would establish facts. I said the company would follow those facts. He nodded once and left the room. The shift in family dynamics occurred without confrontation. The board controlled the process. The audit established the timeline. The company followed documented procedures. My decision was not to retaliate. My decision was to maintain the standards the company needed. The process moved forward based on evidence, not emotion. The next steps depended on the final report, not on personal history. The audit team delivered the final report on a Monday morning. The document was comprehensive. It listed every procedural failure with exact dates, names, and missing approvals. The board scheduled an emergency meeting that same afternoon. All executives were required to attend. The meeting room was full before the scheduled time because everyone understood the implications. Dr. Caldwell opened the session by outlining the main findings. The report identified repeated breaches of internal procedures. It presented communication gaps between executives and department heads. It showed poor documentation practices across multiple divisions. It also confirmed that mismanagement did not originate from a single event, but accumulated over several years. The evidence was consistent and supported by multiple data sources. The board chair explained the next agenda item. They would vote on whether to restructure the executive leadership. This part was not unexpected. The audit report made it clear the company needed changes at the top. The board members reviewed each section of the report before the vote. They did not debate personal matters. They evaluated operational failures, response times, and compliance issues. The first vote concerned my father's position. The board voted to remove him from the role of chief executive officer. He would remain a shareholder, but not hold any executive authority. The vote passed with a strong majority. The decision was final. The second vote concerned my brother. The audit team recorded multiple instances where he moved sensitive documents without permission, accessed archive files without authorization, and failed to report data inconsistencies. The board voted to suspend him from the company pending a follow-up review. The suspension was immediate. No one raised their voice. No one argued. The decisions followed the audit report. The board then discussed long-term leadership. Several members stated that the company needed stability and transparent decision-making. They suggested appointing a new board member who had demonstrated accurate reporting and consistent cooperation during the audit period. Dr. Caldwell expressed support for this proposal. The board nominated me for an independent board seat. The vote was direct and fast. The motion passed without opposition. Dr. Caldwell informed me of the outcome. The board formalized the appointment and updated the internal records before the meeting adjourned. After the announcement, the room remained quiet. Employees and executives packed their materials and left without unnecessary conversation. The company's direction was now clear. My father stayed behind. He asked for a moment. He said he disagreed with the decision, but accepted that the audit report left little room for alternatives. He said he understood the board had acted within its authority. He did not request sympathy. He did not attempt to reverse the vote. He acknowledged the result. My brother did not speak. He walked out of the room without commenting. Later that week, the interim management team implemented the new structure. They amended the approval system, updated the executive flowchart, and issued new compliance guidelines. They reassigned several responsibilities to department directors. Meetings became more organized. Documentation became consistent. Employees adapted because the changes were straightforward and clearly documented. Vendors responded positively to the updated communication procedures. Several partners sent written acknowledgments that the company handled operations more efficiently. This feedback supported the board's decision to implement structural changes. A week later, the board held a follow-up meeting for strategic planning. They reviewed upcoming contracts, department budgets, and quarterly projections. They asked me to contribute to the planning session. I provided the documentation that my team had prepared. The board used the material to adjust timelines and assign responsibilities across departments. The meeting remained procedural and focused. My mother called the next morning. She said the board treated my father unfairly. She said the company should have given him another chance. She said families should protect each other. The call lasted less than 3 minutes because she repeated the same point without acknowledging the audit report. I informed her that all decisions were based on documented evidence. She did not respond and ended the call. Over the next several weeks, the company stabilized under the new structure. The reorganization reduced administrative delays. Department heads reported improved communication. The audit team performed its final review and confirmed that the corrective measures were effective. Employees began requesting regular updates from the new board committee. The requests were practical. They asked for clarity on project timelines, compliance requirements, and future goals. The board issued written summaries after each meeting. The transparency improved internal morale. A few news outlets contacted the company. They asked for comments about the leadership changes. The board released a short statement. It said the company completed an internal audit and implemented structural adjustments. It did not mention the family. It did not reference internal conflicts. The statement focused entirely on stability and compliance. My father sent a letter a month after the vote. He said he would step back from day-to-day business activity. He said he would focus on managing his remaining investments. The letter was brief and did not contain emotional language. It acknowledged the situation without adding commentary. My brother sent no communication. By the end of the quarter, the company's financial reports showed steady performance. Revenue remained stable, expenses decreased due to new systems, and project timelines improved. The board attributed the progress to procedural consistency. Several employees approached me during routine meetings. They said the company felt more organized. They said decisions were documented more clearly. They said they appreciated the structure. Their feedback focused on operations, not personal matters. The board requested a long-term strategy proposal for the next fiscal year. They asked for measurable targets and risk assessments. I prepared the proposal with my team. The document included projected revenue staffing requirements, compliance policies, and communication procedures. The board reviewed it and approved the plan with minor revisions. As the fiscal year closed, the company remained stable. The chaos from earlier months no longer affected daily operations. The board maintained the restructured leadership model. The audit report remained archived as an internal reference. My role as a board member continued without disruption. The position required regular meetings, documentation reviews, and strategic planning sessions. None of the responsibilities relied on family relationships. The work followed consistent procedures. My father adjusted to his new situation over time. He attended shareholder meetings but said little. He did not attempt to influence decisions. My brother stayed out of the company entirely. My mother avoided discussions about business. The shift in family dynamics settled into a consistent pattern. Interaction was minimal. Communication stayed professional or limited. No confrontations occurred. The company moved forward because the board enforced structure and accountability. The outcome did not depend on dramatic events. It came from documented processes, accurate reporting, and consistent oversight. They spent years telling a story where I didn't belong. But the final chapter wasn't about revenge. It was about the structure I built for myself. That structure was true, and the truth I realized was the only justice I needed. If this story reflects something you've experienced, share it below.